at the very beginning of chapter 1. Now, chapter 1, of course, is just simply titled Jack, right? This is where you kind of get the history on Elway Sr., where he grew up, state of Washington, Port Angeles, and kind of his trek through the coaching ranks. But this is interesting because if you think about the biggest curse Elway has had as a front office guy, right? It's that he could never solve the quarterback position post Manning and just couldn't draft a quarterback to save his life. Now, the jury's still out on Drew Lock. That's a separate thing. He could end up, Elway getting the last laugh on that as far as his resume as a quarterback drafter or whatever. In retrospect, years down the road, if the Broncos end up really hitting on Drew Lock. But for now, jury's out on Drew. And John has always struggled to draft the quarterback. And it was these giraffes, right? In 2012, it was 6'7", 6'8", whatever Brock Osweiler was. And then when he picked one in the first round in 2016 and Paxton Lynch, another 6'7" guy. And we know what was so frustrating about the Brock Osweiler pick at the time was Russell Wilson had been making some noise. Now, Russell Wilson then, as a prospect coming out of Wisconsin in 2012, was not the same Russell Wilson that he was even 2 years later as a world champion quarterback that beat the Broncos in the Super Bowl. But he had made some noise. He had switched his career from playing baseball to being more of the football guy. Ended up going on to have 2 really good years at Wisconsin, but they weren't transcendent. I mean, this guy wasn't like some Heisman candidate or something like that. Russell Wilson was a very intriguing young prospect, but if you were going to hit on him, you had to discover him through true scouting. Like you had to go down the rabbit hole and look past his measurables because, of course, Russell Wilson, a little bit on the smallish size, right? Or side. And so John, obviously, that made an impression on him. He looked at, it seemed like to me, the first thing John looked at as a scout eye was a quarterback's frame. Did he have an NFL body frame or not? And that's actually captured quite interestingly here. I'm going to read from this excerpt. It's on page 2. All right, I'm going to quote it here. This is Jason Cole. Quote, Jack also had a knack for recognizing passion. In early 2001, he was working in the personnel department with the Denver Broncos, preparing for the draft. John Elway, of course, by this point, 3 years retired, John went to the office. He was trying to learn the scouting business from his dad. Jack was watching a tape of a quarterback and asked John what he thought. John took a quick look and said the young passer looked kind of small for the pro game. Jack shot back. Do you see the heart and passion he plays with? Do you see how much he loves the game? Jack understood how great Drew Brees was before Brees was drafted. For all of Jack's understanding about measurable qualities and projections, he also knew how to see beyond them. Jack never got to see how right he was about Brees. He passed away of a heart attack in Palm Springs, California on April 15th, 2001, less than a week before the draft and years before Brees became a superstar. Jan found Jack in his chair in front of the television. She joked he must have gone quickly because he didn't have time to switch the station from the home shopping network. All right, close quote. So that's been something that John, I think, has maybe had it's kind of been a blind spot for him, is quarterback measurables. And that's a good example right there, is the first thing that jumped out to him when, just at a relative glance, when his father said, hey, what do you think of this cue that he was looking at on tape? John went to the measurables. What can we infer from that? You would think that he maybe learned his lesson because, of course, John, although Jack didn't live to see what Drew Brees became, John sure enough did. You'd think he'd maybe learn from that. But 2012 was a good example of why or how John really didn't take that to heart. Dave, what's up, bro? He says, Jack's opinion versus John's regarding a young Drew Brees. Indeed. Very interesting. Very interesting. Now, when the Broncos were on the pre-draft trail in 2012, you got to remember that it was a different world we were living in at the time. This was Well, no, here's the best way to put it. So 2011, John Elway comes in, gets the job. The Broncos are 1 year removed from having drafted Tim Tebow. And we all know what happened in 2011 with that miraculous Tebow season that was ugly at times, spectacular at others, and overall just really fun to watch that year. But the Broncos, when the pre-draft process started, kind of had a guy. They had Tim. And then, a couple months into the offseason, the Colts make that tectonic decision to release Peyton Manning. John Elway goes hell-bent for breakfast in a way. I mean, he was, of all the teams that went in on Peyton Manning, John's was the softest sell, which was actually what drew Peyton in the closest and wanting to come to Denver was John didn't try to strong-arm him. But Peyton Manning getting signed in March changed everything relative to Tim Tebow, ended up getting traded to the Jets. And then the Broncos needed to have a future option behind Peyton. And so when you have Peyton Manning on your roster, you can afford to be maybe a little less or a little more. You can take some chances maybe, all right? But still, Russell Wilson was heavily scouted by Denver Broncos. At the Senior Bowl that year, I can remember quite a lot of press about the Broncos talking with Russell Wilson. We know he was on their radar. But when the chips were down and they went on the clock, they ended up drafting Brock Osweiler. And in retrospect, it all made sense, right? In the final analysis, we find out that one of the reasons John Elway was drawn to Brock, obviously the measurables, but he was close personal friends with John's son, Jack, named after his grandfather, of course. Jack was recruited to play quarterback at Arizona State and didn't have the same mental makeup as his dad or his granddad, and ended up kind of walking away from playing football. But one of his close buddies there, fellow football recruit, Brock Osweiler, and so John knew Brock personally, and that ended up snowballing into what ended up being a second-round pick.